October 13th, 1307, Friday. King Philip IV of France launched the largest special forces raid in human history. Overnight, thousands of Knights Templar were dragged from their beds and thrown into dungeons. The crimes they were accused of were heinous: spitting on the cross, worshipping a goat-headed demon, and engaging in homosexuality. Sounds like a religious purge, right? Wrong. This was not only a lie, but it was also the largest bank robbery in history. The robber was the king. The victim was the wealthiest and most powerful multinational financial group in Europe at the time. This is the truth about the Knights Templar. They were not magicians searching for the Holy Grail. They were the Goldman Sachs of the Middle Ages, the Federal Reserve with a private army. They invented modern banking and controlled the cash flow of the entire European continent. Yet, they met their doom because they committed the most fatal mistake a banker can make: lending money to a thug who owns an army. Today, we will strip away the mysterious veil of the Guardians of the Holy Grail and review the rise and fall of this organization from a purely financial and economic perspective. We will explore: how did a group of monks who swore a vow of poverty build the first multinational bank in human history? What financial derivatives did they invent to monopolize Europe's cash flow? And how did this financial empire, which seemed too big to fail, ultimately die in the game between absolute power and defenseless capital? Welcome to the fall of Wall Street in the Middle Ages. The story of the Knights Templar begins in 1119. Initially, they were truly poor. The founder, Hugues de Payenne, and his 8 comrades came to Jerusalem and swore to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Their full name was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Notice the word poor, pauperes. Their emblem was 2 knights riding a single horse, symbolizing that they were too poor to afford separate horses. However, this security business soon encountered a huge commercial pain point, and solving this pain point allowed them to make a magnificent transformation from security guards to bankers. In the 12th century, if you were a devout noble living in London or Paris and wanted to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, your biggest risk was not the scimitars of pagans, but liquidity risk. You needed to carry a huge amount of money to pay for food and lodging for a year or two. Imagine carrying tens of kilograms of gold and silver coins across a European continent rampant with bandits and a war-torn Asia Minor. You were essentially a walking ATM with a very high suicide rate. The Knights Templar keenly discovered this trillion-dollar market gap. Using their network of armed strongholds established in Europe and the Middle East, they invented a product that changed human financial history: the letter of credit. The operational logic of this system was simply the medieval version of the SWIFT system, or Western Union. A pilgrim would go to the Templar branch in London, Temple Church, before setting off, and deposit 1,000 gold coins. The Templar accountant would take the money and give him a piece of parchment. Written on this paper was the deposit amount, the date, and, most crucially, it was stamped with an extremely complex encrypted code, cipher. The Templars invented a cipher table based on the Maltese cross, which only insiders could read. The pilgrim would sew this lightweight parchment into his underwear and set off empty-handed. When he safely arrived in Jerusalem, he would walk into the Templar branch there and present the parchment. The accountant there would verify the code and, if correct, withdraw 1,000 gold coins, minus a small handling fee, from the Jerusalem vault and give them to him. This was a genius financial innovation. It achieved the physical separation of funds. The gold coins didn't actually move. only the information moved. Through this system, the Knights Templar effectively monopolized the foreign exchange settlement business between the East and the West. But that wasn't all. Once you control the cash flow, you can play with leverage. Since the money deposited by the pilgrim would not be withdrawn at the other end for several months or even years, the funds settling in the vault during this period became massive float. The Knights Templar began to use these idle funds for investment. They bought land, ran farms, built fleets, and even got involved in import and export trade. In just a few decades, this organization that swore a vow of poverty became the largest landowner in Europe. They owned 9,000 manors across Europe. They possessed their own Mediterranean fleet. In 1191, they even spent 100,000 gold coins to buy the entire island of Cyprus from Richard the Lionheart. Note that they didn't buy a piece of land. They bought a sovereign state. This was the earliest prototype of the concept of corporate personhood. Each individual knight still strictly abided by his vows, wearing rough clothes and owning no private property. But the Knights Templar as a corporation was wealthy enough to rival nations, possessing a balance sheet that made kings jealous. When you have money, the next step is to use money to make money. But in the Middle Ages, there was a huge legal obstacle: the Bible. Canon law strictly prohibited usury. At that time, any form of money-making money was considered a sin, and lenders were even categorized with prostitutes, as it was believed they were both selling time, which belonged to God. If the Knights Templar had collected interest blatantly, they would have been banned by the church long ago. But as the smartest financial elites of that era, they invented a series of complex financial derivatives that perfectly bypassed God's regulations. These methods would appear quite sophisticated even on today's Wall Street. Method 1. The exchange rate arbitrage. The letter of credit business was not only convenient, but also hid huge profit margins. You deposited livres tournois in France, but withdrew bezants in Jerusalem. The Knights Templar would manipulate the exchange rate. They didn't charge interest. They charged the exchange rate spread. This was considered a legal currency exchange service at the time and was completely compliant. But in reality, high interest was already embedded in the exchange rate. Method 2. The rent charge. Suppose a lord urgently needed money and asked the Knights Templar for a loan. The Templars wouldn't say, "Interest is 10%. They would sign a contract. You mortgage your farm to us, and we lend you 1,000 gold coins. Since the farm is now under our management, the annual output of the farm, wheat, wine, belongs to us as our management fee. This income, called management fee or rent, was actually interest. And it was often more profitable than charging interest directly. Method 3. Late fees. The Templars might not set interest when lending, but they would set extremely strict repayment dates. Once overdue, the penalty would grow exponentially. This was legal gambling, betting that the borrower could not turn over funds on time. Relying on these means, the Knights Templar became the central bank for the royal families of Europe. Their Paris headquarters, the Temple Tower, was effectively the French treasury. The French king's tax revenue was deposited directly into the Temple Tower. If the king wanted to spend money, he had to write a check to the Knights Templar. Across the Channel, King Henry III of England even pawned the crown jewels to the Knights Templar in exchange for funds to fight wars. Imagine that scene. The supreme ruler of a country could not even redeem his own crown and could only watch helplessly as it was locked in the safe of a private company. This inversion of power planted the seeds of their destruction. They were not only bankers, but also auditors and trustees. Due to their identity as monks and their strong military strength, kings often designated the Knights Templar as a third-party guarantor when signing treaties. Even during wars between England and France, military funds for both countries were transferred through the Templar network. They were like a combination of Goldman Sachs, PwC, and Blackwater in the Middle Ages. Too big to fail and too strong to be messed with. Until they met their destined nemesis, King Philip IV of France. Philip IV, nicknamed Philip the Fair. He was perhaps the coldest and most calculating monarch in medieval France. But he had a fatal weakness: poverty. Not because he wasn't frugal, but because war burned money. Philip IV spent his life fighting wars. Against England, against Flanders. War was a bottomless pit that swallowed gold and silver. To keep the war machine running, Philip IV exhausted almost every financial means available. Phase 1: taxation and confiscation. He first taxed the church, which led to his excommunication by Pope Boniface VIII. But this didn't solve the problem. Next, he turned his eyes to marginalized groups. In 1306, he ordered the expulsion of Jews from France and confiscated all their property. This gave him a brief recovery, but it was spent quickly. Phase 2: currency debasement. This was the most shameless method. Philip IV ordered the recall of gold coins to be reminted, mixing in cheap copper, but keeping the face value unchanged. This led to hyperinflation. Riots broke out in Paris, and angry citizens even besieged the royal palace. Ironically, during that riot, Philip IV had to flee into the Paris headquarters of the Knights Templar for refuge. It was the Templars' sturdy walls and elite guards that saved the king's life. However, this refuge experience actually hardened the king's resolve to eliminate the Templars. Why? Because when he lived in the Temple Tower, he saw the Templars' vaults with his own eyes. The mountains of gold and silver and the extremely efficient ledger management made him both jealous and terrified. At that time, Philip IV was already the largest debtor to the Knights Templar. He owed the Templars so much money that it might have taken several years of French tax revenue to pay it off. In the king's eyes, the Knights Templar were no longer protectors, but a state within a state. They had an army, 15,000 knights and squires within France. They had fortresses, they controlled the country's financial lifeline, and they only obeyed the Pope, paying no taxes to the king. For a sovereign monarch committed to centralization, this was an intolerable strategic threat. Moreover, from a financial statement perspective, eliminating this creditor would not only clear the debt to zero, but also allow for the takeover of assets. It was a business with an infinite rate of return. Philip IV once tried to solve it through peaceful means. He applied to join the Knights Templar, and even hinted that he wanted to be the Grand Master. This was actually an attempt at a hostile takeover. But Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, although an excellent warrior, was a terrible politician. He arrogantly rejected the king, thinking that with the Pope's umbrella and the Templars' reputation, the king wouldn't dare touch him. He was wrong. He underestimated how crazy a king on the brink of bankruptcy could be. The operation in 1307 demonstrated Philip IV's amazing administrative execution. Arresting the Knights Templar was not easy. These were professional soldiers with arms and castles. If news leaked, even if only one branch resisted, France would fall into civil war. Philip IV adopted unrestricted legal warfare. He did not accuse the Templars of corruption or treason, because if accused of secular crimes, the Templars had the right to demand a trial by an ecclesiastical court, which would drag on for years, and the Pope would mediate. Philip IV chose a nuclear-level charge: heresy. In the Middle Ages, once accused of heresy, all legal protections became invalid. The Inquisition had the right to intervene directly, and the defendant's assets would be frozen immediately. To substantiate this charge, Philip IV's spies fabricated a whole set of sensational stories. Knights kissing each other's anuses during initiation ceremonies, spitting on the cross, and worshipping an idol named Baphomet. These accusations precisely hit the superstitious psychology of the medieval public, instantly destroying the public image of the Templars. The arrest operation on Friday, October 13th, was extremely successful. There was almost no resistance. Why? Because the knights were bewildered. They were used to fighting pagans on the battlefield, but didn't know how to fight their own people carrying arrest warrants. Moreover, as bankers, they relied too much on rules. They thought this was just a blackmail negotiation by the king, and as long as they endured, the Pope would come to save them. Next came the interrogation. This was not a court debate. It was a slaughterhouse. In the prisons of Paris, the Inquisition used the cruelest torture devices. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, a battle-hardened veteran, collapsed under the threat of fire and the rack. He confessed to those absurd crimes. This move of extracting confessions through torture was fatal. Once the Grand Master pleaded guilty, the Knights Templar was legally bankrupt. Pope Clement V, who lived in Avignon, France at the time and was controlled by the French king, was forced to issue a bull announcing the dissolution of the Knights Templar. This was a perfect asset liquidation. The Templar assets within France were all confiscated. Although nominally these assets were supposed to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, Philip IV retained a huge amount of cash in the name of custody fees and debt deduction. However, history left a mystery. Although Philip IV arrested the people and seized the land, he did not find the legendary core vault. At that time, the Knights Templar possessed the most powerful fleet in Europe, docked at the port of La Rochelle. On the eve of the arrest operation, this fleet mysteriously weighed anchor and sailed away, disappearing into the mists of the Atlantic. Some say they went to Scotland, some say they went to Portugal, and some even say they took the treasure to the Americas. This is the inspiration for the movie National Treasure. From a financial perspective, this was likely an emergency asset transfer carried out by the Templars at the last moment. March 1314, a small island on the Seine. 70-year-old Jacques de Molay was tied to the stake. In the final moments of his life, he retracted all confessions and declared the Templars innocent. As the fire rose, it is said he shouted a curse at the king and the Pope in the flames. "You will face judgment before God within a year." This is not just a legend, it is a historical coincidence. A month later, the Pope died suddenly. 8 months later, the 46-year-old Philip IV suffered a sudden stroke while hunting and died. Although the curse sounds satisfying, from the perspective of historical materialism, the destruction of the Knights Templar leaves us with extremely profound financial lessons. First, capital cannot exist independently of violence. The Knights Templar had mountains of gold and silver, a tight organization, and even some armed forces. But they did not have sovereignty. They were a multinational corporation parasitic on the sovereignty of various countries. When the host, the king, decided not to abide by the rules of the game and flipped the table directly, all contracts, ledgers, and wealth instantly became waste paper. They were the first case in history of capital without the protection of a state machine being swallowed by power-possessing violence. Second, do not lend money to desperate gamblers. Whether this gambler is a king or a modern real estate tycoon. When the debt becomes large enough, the creditor is no longer God, but a hostage. Philip IV proved a truth with his actions. If you owe the bank $100, that is your problem. If you owe the bank $10 billion, that is the bank's problem, especially when you hold the army in your hand and the bank only holds legal texts. The embers of the Knights Templar were extinguished, but the financial system they invented, letters of credit, checks, cross-border settlement, survived and became the cornerstone of modern capitalism. Today, when we swipe cards, transfer money, or watch the ups and downs of Wall Street, do not forget that on that Friday 700 years ago, a group of bankers holding swords paid the first expensive tuition fee for this set of game rules with their lives. They were God's bankers, and also the victims of power.